determined and we just don't care who we play or who we maul. Our team's gonna rule them all. We're proud and we're tough. We're not stopping till we've had enough. We're mean, we're on the prowl. Our team's gonna knock them out. Everybody's gonna scream and
Mr. Tunks was one of the outstanding figures in North Sydney history. He was also a cricket fanatic, and he organised the first-class cricket match in Australia between New South Wales and Victoria in the 1830s. He also got North Sydney Oval dedicated as a cricket ground in 1860 before the public park was there. But later he got it declared a public park, St Leonard's Park, and he personally planted most of the fig trees in the park. He was mayor and the state member of parliament, and eventually kept on planting trees, and he eventually dug the holes himself and fell into one of the holes and reportedly died in hospital. It started as a cricket ground in 1860, so it was a cricket ground really nearly 50 years before the Rugby League came along.
Well, the legendary meeting which established Rugby League occurred in Huddersfield in Yorkshire in the north of England in 1895. It's actually quite an interesting series of events which in part has been misrepresented by historians until quite recently. It turns out that what it was all about is a lockout by the members of the British Rugby Union to keep workers out of their game. What had happened in the 1860s and 1870s is that rugby union in England had been increasingly taken over by the workers. And members of the commercial and professional elite that were associated with the British Rugby Football Union didn't particularly appreciate that. So they made conditions more and more difficult for workers to participate, particularly in relation to professionalism, whether or not you should be paid for sport, whether or not you should be paid in particular for broken time, such that effectively the workers had no other way out than to organise their own group, the Northern Union, and that happened in 1895.
North Sydney was very much a working class area, particularly on the waterfront. So you had boat builders, you had marine engineering workshops, you had your coal loading depots, you had your gas works, that type of industry. 1901 census said there were about, for single men, if you want to get that specific, about 6,000 single men in North Sydney. However, if you're looking at a football age, you're looking at probably about 1,200 single men.
Well, North Sydney in those days was a very lively place, particularly on Friday nights. All the shops were open, band playing, all the people in the street. A painter used to paint with the brush in his teeth, armless painter. Things like that attracted the crowds. Henry Lawson used to kick around North Sydney. I saw him, Henry Lawson, trying to get a dog to drink some beer. He held it out for the dog. The dog didn't care for it.
In 1906, in England, the number of players had been reduced from 15 to 13. That necessarily meant there was more room on a football field for action to take place. And the spectators really warmed to that.
One fellow called Jack Sullivan, he says North Sydney was a close-knit community. Everybody knew everybody else. And if a stranger came amongst us, well, then we asked who they were and what they were doing here.
It was more self-contained. In many respects, there was no particular need to travel across to the city, and it really developed along quite different lines to the rest of, say, the inner suburbs of Sydney. And many of the people attached to the North Sydney Rugby League Football Club, including the very first president, Jack Finelli, were connected to the maritime industry. He was a tugmaster, but other of the pioneers like Len Schofield and others, they were ferry captains. C.H. Ford, one of the early vice presidents of New South Wales Rugby League, a Yorkshireman connected to the North Sydney Rugby League Football Club. He too was a harbour ferrymaster. All these people were essentially connected via their work on the waterfront one way or another.
And sport was a very high priority amongst our North Sydney residents. And many of them would, they'd play football in the winter and they'd be out there sailing on the harbour in their 18-footers in the summer and wearing their football jerseys as well. You had families like the Courtneys, the Barnetts. They had traditions of playing football. You had Tedder Courtney from 1908 to 1910 and his younger brother Jack played in the 1920s. So families very much played football, and it was a tradition to keep on playing in that family.
Well, rugby league in Australia wouldn't have happened at all without two things. One is that, of course, there was already a split in terms of rugby league, then called Northern Union, in England. But the other thing that happened was that in 1907, a team of professional footballers led by A.H. Baskerville from New Zealand actually lobbed up in Sydney on their way through to play a series of games in Northern England. Baskerville had a number of Sydney connections, perhaps J.J. Gilton, the entrepreneur, was one of them, and effectively there was a need for them to actually have someone to play against on the same basis that they were going to play in England, that is, on a professional basis. What we see in 1907 is a series of games being established between a group of people who were subsequently called the Pioneers and this touring team of New Zealanders. In 1907 too, a particular footballer, a glebe waterside worker,
by a fellow named Alec Burden, played rugby union. And he got injured. The union paid no doctor's bill. He was off out of work for weeks. He got no compensation.
The affluent, who were the rugby union people, I don't know what arrangements they made, but I mean the working man, he couldn't depend on the charity or good nature of some of the officials who were running the rugby union. They had to look after themselves, and that is why the rugby league started, because they weren't after money for playing. They were after the money to compensate them when they couldn't go to work as a result of injuries, and that's the start and finish of it.
In 1907, there were a number of meetings which took place at various venues. Victor Trumper's sports stall, the cricketer, Victor Trumper's sports stall was one of them. The Bateman's Crystal Hotel was another. Indeed, the founding meeting took place in August 1907. But really the impetus to get a rugby league football club established in North Sydney was a pretty natural one. It had already had a rugby union club which was similarly divided on the sorts of issues which were dividing the football community generally, and a number of those pioneers of 1907, Devereux being one, Harry Glanville being another, Jim Abercrombie being the third, were part of the nucleus of the squad which became the first rugby league football team.
Well, of course, as you know, in 1908 it was a rugby union game or just prior to that, and only because Delhi Messenger and a few other notables changed over to rugby league, I don't think rugby league would have ever started.
I think they not only had the population, they had the interest, most certainly. They had the young men here who were very much sports-minded, keen to play sports of any type. A lot of them went from rugby union to play rugby league at that time.
The foundation meeting of the North Sydney Rugby League Football Club takes place in February of 1908. One of the stories about that is that it was the first of any of the meetings which took place. I doubt that that's true, but I think it is certainly true that the North Sydney Club was the first to actually pay the affiliation fee.
North, south, east and west. They were the four as far as what could we say, the geographical part of Sydney was concerned. And then, of course, there was Glebe, Balmain, Newtown and Newcastle and Cumberland. They were the other teams to start the competition.
This bill was used as South Sydney's first game was South Sydney East, was played at Birchgrave Oval at Balmain in 1908.
It's very interesting, actually. The North Sydney Junior League was a founding junior league. It was founded in 1909. Willoughby were one of the founding clubs. We also had the Blues Point Kioras, which later became McMahon's Point, who were one of our strongest clubs. Our records show that Crow's Nest could have been around in 1909, but were definitely in the not long after that. Neutral Bay were probably around in those days as well. So it was based on the lower North Shore.
Well, yes, they didn't have a ground. They couldn't get access to a suitable ground.
How do they survive?
Well, they survived because of the love of the game and the love of the sacrifice made by people whose heart and soul was in the game and were prepared to play for next to nothing.
Reading the history of it, there was a major commotion because then, as now, the oval was overused by a whole variety of sports. So the leagues virtually had to muscle in on the thing, but the big issue was that they wanted to fence the oval. It had never been fenced. Now, of course, that brought forth a lot of criticism by people who didn't want to see a public park fenced off. They also wanted all the big trees chopped down because people used to get up in the trees and watch the match without paying. So there was also fights about that. But eventually the league got their way and the ground was fenced for the first time.
Walked down to the oval. If I didn't have the money, we'd slip around the back and try and get across the across the fence with all those things that we've always seen. And the crowds were adequate, quite all right, and they were patriotic, of course, and all one-eyed. And it was very exciting in those days. Before that, of course, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I went down with my father, and he pointed out the various aspects of the game. That would be 1913, something like that.
Well, my father came across from New Zealand in 1909. From what I can gather, it was with a Wellington rugby league team, but I wouldn't be 100% certain on that. And he settled in North Sydney and played for, and definitely come and played with North Sydney. He worked on the wharves.
They were called the shoremen because, and they were the shoremen because they worked on the wharves and you know, they were more or less the labouring type. They were not the affluent that lived at Pymble and Wahroonga and up the upper North Shore.
What were the North Sydney jumpers like?
Stripes, you know, black and red stripes. Not broad ones, which they had later on, but the 3 or 4 inches, which was the usual thing in those days. There was no fancy jumpers in those days. They were just as long as they showed the black and red.
As Jason Taylor brings out North Sydney in their 1908 style jerseys, taking the tackle on him. Fairly getting the pass back. It came away from Larson, then to Jason Taylor. Taylor slipping through, got his pass back through Soden, then away to Fairley. Fairley getting down the short side. No defence from Western Suburbs at all. The moment that David Fairley was through the line, there was no cover, nothing inside of him, but just green grass. This is a little easier for Jason Taylor out on the left. Hooks this one back in nicely. Flags are up for the first time for Jason Taylor, and the Bears now get
in 1913, the football at North Sydney Oval was well attended, and the first match that I remember ever seeing was North Sydney playing Glebe. And my father pointed out at that time, just watch this, and the winger had got away with the ball down the wing, and of course he was blocked. And next thing they centred the ball, and there were the 3 Burge brothers, all over, well over 6 feet, charging down the centre there to pick up the ball and score.
The Englishmen came here in 1910. See, we went there in 1908. They came here in 1910. They came again in 1914. They came again in 1920. But our tours were much fewer. We went in 1908. We didn't go again till 11 and 12 we went. That was when Chris McKibbett took the side away in 11 and 12. But there were no kangaroo tours then until 21, 22. You see, that's how the game got established out here. No doubt about that. We owe the Poms a lot.
In 1914, 1915, the members of the hierarchy of the New South Wales Rugby Union decided to disband their competition for the duration of the war. They believed it was wrong to be engaged in frivolous sport while people were dying in the trenches. The people attached to Rugby League had decided that This was a decision made again in the Second World War that it was important for sport to be conducted on an ongoing basis, that people had some ongoing sense of normality, and so rugby league did continue. Really, it was the making of rugby league.
The First World War, every night the papers come out, be a list of those killed and wounded. Used to be in the paper every night.
When the war broke out, I was only 7, and quite a lot of the of my relatives who were old enough to enlist, they didn't come back at all.
The average feeling was, by the average person, that was the last war we'd ever see.
North Sydney was a very unsuccessful rugby league team until 1920.
Newcastle pulled out after 2 seasons, and then they formed their own competition up there. That's why the Newcastle comp. See, I played in the Newcastle comp in 1940. I was captain and coach of Waratah Mayfield. Cumberland went out very early, and then Annandale came in after 1910. University came in. St George came in 21. And we didn't have any more then till Canterbury came in 35.
And in those days, you had to live in the area that you played for. See, even though some of them lived outside and had an address in the area.
Well, the early 1920s were dominated by the North Sydney Rugby League Football Club. How did that happen? I think in essence it happened because they had the best rugby league backline in the competition, and perhaps, arguably, the best rugby league backline in the history of rugby league.
One of the famous 1922 North Sydney teams were Teddy Taplin, fullback, Harold Horder and Cess Blinkhorn were the 2 wingers. Then the centres, Herman Peters and Frank Rule. 5'8", Dallas Hodgins. The halfback was Duncan Thompson. What a back line that was. Then the forwards, Jim Baker, George Green, Jim Pye, J.C. Ives, also an international, Chris McGrath, Al Fall and R. Farnell. Great players.
Herman Peters, a brilliant player. He played for the state. I saw him play on the cricket ground.
Well, Duncan Thompson, of course, was always known to me as he was the will-o'-the-wisp, you know, and I'd read about him as a young fellow, and I knew, of course, that he only had one lung, and that he was shot during the war, and he was part of the machine at North Sydney in the 2 years that they won the comp in 21 and 22. And of course it was well known in rugby league circles about how he reacted to being suspended in 1923 supposedly for kicking somebody. And all I ever knew about Duncan Thompson was just the opposite to someone who would kick someone. Anyhow, he was charged with this, and he was so distraught about it all that he went back to Queensland.
Now I can remember Duncan. He was a half-back, and he was a damn good player, a brainy player.
I'd like to send a cheerio call to all those fans in front of whom I had the pleasure of playing way back in the 20s. And there's lots of them in Sydney. I would like to send a message to all those people who are so generous in their praise and their tolerance during my period. It's the first time I've ever been asked to do so, but I can assure you I grabbed the opportunity with both hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan Thompson.
George Green, he was, I don't think he was an Aboriginal. I think he was an Islander. And quite a nice, a real gentleman, real nice fellow. He worked at the post office at Redfern. And he used to come across, and he was quite willing to come across to us juniors and show us a few points.
What about Frank Rule?
Frank Rule had been badly injured in World War I, And in spite of his persistent injuries, it didn't stop him being almost out of this world tackler.
Jeff Hilda, he's a big fat fella. And I say I went to school with his son, that's the main I know about him, but he was always there and always very interested in trying to get the team, you know, to the top condition.
Jeff Hilda was a neighbour of mine at Lane Cove when I came to play North Sydney. And he lived about 50 yards up the street on the other side of the road when I was captain of Norths. This was in the 40s. And he told me that he was associated with North, but I didn't believe him, you know. And in those times, I didn't know who was with Norths or anything else, you know. And it was only years later when I got that book there, and I opened, and I said to my wife, "Look, there's old Jeff Hilda." As I was going training, of course I used to get advice from every second house, you know, on what to do and all that sort of thing and what not to do. This is when I was playing with Norths. And he used to say to me, "When I was coaching Norths, I learned them how to run." That was his big theme. I learned them how to run. He said, "Learn them how to run." You know, and oh, good, Mr. Hilda, you know, I'd go. But I didn't, I thought he was a rubber or a doorman or something like that, you know. But he was the head trainer.
Svespenko was a freak. He had the greatest fend of any player I've ever seen. His record still stands today in England. The most tries scored by an Australian. It's still a record today. I think it was 23 tries, I think. A player would come to tackle him, he'd have this fend, he'd cut his hand. He'd cut your hands right away, he'd put you on the ground. Not once, he'd done it a dozen times.
Blinkhorn played with Norths from 1914 to 1918, and then he went to play with South Sydney in 1919, and that's where he got tied up with Horder, you see. And he played with Souths in 1919, and then, as legend tells the story, the manager at North Sydney, Lorne Dargan, who coaxed both Horder and Blinkhorn back to North Sydney in 1921 for a suit of clothes, I believe. That's how much money was in the game in those days. A suit of clothes brought them back over to North Sydney, and they won the comp in 21 and 22.
Well, he's a legend. I mean, he was a wonderful player. He had a wonderful sidestep as well as speed. And I don't think, at his best, there was no winger better than Harold Horder.
I saw Horder playing against England. He was playing for Australia on the Sydney cricket ground. He took the ball behind the line on the Paddington end. He runs it towards the winger, his opposite winger. He sidestepped him and come in field. At the least, he sidestepped 7 players. It could have been more. He went right through the centre of the field, come to Sullivan, the fullback, sidestepped him and scored between the posts. The greatest try I've ever seen in my life.
It was right down Bridge Street end of the game. We were playing against Newtown, and Newtown put the ball up and under. It bounced. Harold Horder picked it up, beat the whole team, ran up the whole, beat the team, ran up to the goal post, forced the ball and kicked the goal, and the referee hadn't caught up with him. He's very fast and very good.
In that tremendous side of 21 and 22, there was only one international forward there, and that was J.C. Ives. He went away with the Kangaroos in 21. With the other 4, international backs like the Horder, Blenkhorn, Herman Peters, and well, Frank Rule was picked, but he couldn't go. Dallas Hodgins, you know, they were super players. But George Green was one of the good forwards, and J.C. Ives was the others. Now the other players in the forwards were good players, but they weren't representative players.
I can tell you the one game I do remember. A big forward got away and a fella grabbed him by the back and pulled his pants off. He didn't realise he didn't have any. In those days, he ran the 70 yards, I think, much to the excitement of the women and the crowd. And when he finally got up the line and forced the ball, he realised he had no pants on and sat down quickly, too late. If I digress a little bit and go to the cricket ground, the best game I ever saw there was between North Sydney and Eastern Suburbs. And George Green scored a try, the only try he ever scored in his life, I think. But that was one game that has stuck out in my memory.
Was it because of the crowd?
Yes, I did always think it was about 60,000. And that might have been one of the time when they trampled the gates down and all surged in. But it was a very, very big crowd, and when North Sydney won, everybody threw their hat in the air. I don't know whether they got them back or not, but they were very, very popular.
First past the post, yes. Of course, they never contested a grand final until 1943. Famous North Sydney joke, you know, famous Trivial Pursuit question.
They started to decline around about the 1925, 26s, you see.
And I suppose the only surprising thing is just how quickly they fell apart. By the mid-1920s, the sort of glory days were more or less forgotten, and they retreated to being a very ordinary football team until the mid-1930s.
When fellows like Rex Harrison, Roy Thompson, Doug Dietz, and they began to mature, and they were in the late 30s. See, Rex and Roy and I were in the stateside in the late 30s together. But of course, I was playing with Balmain then. But they and Grantley Bennett, of course, he was another one. You know, well they were rep players, so they started to build up towards the latter half of the 30s, and they became worthy opponents.
Well, I saw the bridge being built, and the impact was that there's going to be a bridge was a good thing. Everybody was for it, because to get across the Sydney Harbour to work and things like that, you had to take the ferries, and the vehicle at Punt that had to take the horse and carts and things like that. There were very many motor cars in those days.
In order to build the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the larger number of hundreds of houses had to be demolished. Effectively, they were the workers' houses that were pulled down.
Killed North Sydney, dead. All the shops were emptied. In Long Walker Street there, the dust and the dirt were around about the shop entrance and not cleaned up. You could have bought the whole lot for a couple of £100, I think.
We were lucky to get a feed at times. My father was working for the Harbour Trust, which later turned to be the Maritime Service, and his wages was about £3.10 a week, and he was trying to support 10 children and a wife, which is almost an hopeless situation.
I had no difficulty in getting a job, but had a very low salary. I was getting 32 shillings a week, and half of that, 16 shillings a week, went in transport.
Glebe went out in 29. They didn't win a competition, and that strengthened Balmain from then on, you see.
I lived just behind Edward Arnold's in Oxford Street, and we used to catch a tram on the corner of Crown Street and Oxford Street to Circular Quay and catch a boat or a ferry across to North Sydney, and then we catch a tram again up the hill to North Sydney Harbour. I used to dread playing there because it was the pitch in the centre was that damn hard that as soon as you hit the ground, yards of skin came off you.
This football was brought back from England in 1929, Kangaroos, by George Treweek. It's autographed by both teams, England and Australia. In the daylight you can read the names on it. Was played on the third test, a 6-all draw at Huddersfield, England in 1929.
When I came back from England, when they said there's a depression started, we never dreamt, because we came back from England thinking everything was rosy, you know. But by gee, before you could say Jack Robinson, was unemployment all over the place. All over the place. It was a very, very difficult time for Australia, really. And to get to be what they are today, it's been a fantastic effort.
I was the youngest of 7 boys, and I left school right in the height of the Depression, and my concern was trying to get a job and bring some money in to a household of a lot of people, with many out of work.
Most people did have, in those days, fairly large families. I came from 7 and Harry 9, and I think the only people who only had 1 or 2 children, whatever, couldn't have any more. I mean, there wasn't the contraception around in those days there is now. And so we just had our family as they came along. I had 10, Red 9. We lived on what our husbands made, and what you didn't have, you know, you just did without. You just couldn't go out and buy it, sort of.
I was born on the 22nd of March 1916 at Forbes in the Central West. I grew a normal life, family life, brothers and sisters, My father worked for the council, and all through the Depression he was never out of work. The amazing thing that always sticks in my mind, being very young at that time more or less, was the fact of the transients going through with the haversack on the back and a sleeping roll and looking for work or looking for food or anything else, and how the majority of them were so good. They would never, you could leave anything out, you could still go out at night time and leave your doors open and nobody would even worry about it.
My recollections of the Depression, firstly, was that it brought out a lot of the good things in people, it brought out a lot of the bad things in people. And in the sorting out, you found that in some people you had formed the wrong impression of them, and they were much better people than you thought they were, and in others, the ones that you had a high opinion of, you found that when the chips were down, they were found wanting.
One of the things that's most interesting about the North Sydney Rugby League Football Club is the way in which it mobilised to help both former players who had fallen on hard times, and one of those was the famous Jimmy Devereux, 1907. He'd actually been a coach in the 1920s, but he'd suffered a great deal of misfortune. He, for instance, had lost a leg in the process of the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
The oval itself, well, it was surrounded by a high paling fence, and the council used to go, I believe, used to get a commission out of the rake off out of the game that was played. They got so much commission for the ground hire, and they planted, the unemployed used to climb the fig trees outside the ground to get a view of the game. So to stop them, the council put barbed wire around the branches and painted with tar to stop the unemployed from viewing the games. So anyone that tells you they were the good old days, they're in another world. There's not many children went hungry, but I'm sure there was plenty of parents that did.
There were hard times in those days, and the Balmain forwards, the Newtown forwards, they were of similar breed, and they came from tough areas, and that's why some of the North Sydney players in the earlier North Sydney sides, they were tough like the McKinnons. They didn't come any tougher than them, the Laurie Dorans, you know. Gee.
People who've studied the history of Australian rules, Victorian rules in Melbourne, also say that this is part of to do with the economic circumstance of the early to mid-1930s, that it did become a harder, tougher game.
Well, Eastern Suburbs were the leading team in those days. I think they won about 3 or 4 premierships in a row. And in the 1937 tour of England, I think they possibly had up to 11 or 12 players picked on the tour. And North Sydney played them one day on North Sydney Oval, I can vividly recall. There was Vic Thickness, Ernie Norman, Ross McKinnon, who forearm jolted Dougie Dietz out of the game, left him unconscious, and because he was later to come and coach North. But North put it to him, but it was, as was the story and has been for years, they got on top of us in the end. And I can recall them playing University in those days. They could generally beat University.
And in 1935-34 I played right through 2nd and 3rd grade, and in 1935 I played 1st grade the whole season, which we were fortunate enough to get into the semi-finals, and South Sydney beat us at the Sydney Cricket Ground in the first semi-final. And the semi-finals were between North and South and East and West.
Yeah, Ray Gillum, I'm pretty certain, was captain of the side, and I think he was a front rower from memory. He was a fine player, and I think that he was a very well respected player. I think the players looked up to him. I know the supporters did. He was a very well-known figure around the North Sydney Oval. On the Bennetts, I'd say they hold some sort of record. Most of the North Sydney records show that there was 5 brothers played, but I reckon there was 6. There was Polly, Grantley, Eric, Ken, Keith, and the younger brother Jeffrey came along later, and I'm sure he had 1 or 2 games third grade. So that'd be 6 brothers. Yeah, Rexhausen, I think, played with Narrabeen Kangaroos, where we're talking now. We're from an area around this area. And he came up through the ranks, of course, and I can remember him saying to me once, so highly regarded was it to be even graded with North Sydney, let alone became a first grader. Yeah, Roy Thompson was a terrific player. Came through the juniors about the same time as Rex Harrison. Roy Thompson and Rex Harrison had a terrific combination, and such that if you went to other grounds and sat near other supporters, they used to say, well, if so you're watching one, if you watch him, the other one will get you. So they had a terrific combination and were both terrific players, attacking players, and both terrific goal kickers. Thompson used to do the kicking, but then Rex was probably only a shandy behind him as a goal kicker.
I played halfback and Rex Harrison was a 5'8". We played together a lot for a long time. He scored more tries than I did. We understood each other's game very well, and we scored points, lots of points.
Roy Thompson was a terrific player, because played for the state in Australia, and I remember he, as a goal kicker, he used to take a very long run. And this one day they played in Queensland and in Brisbane, and the Sunday papers, the crowd up there christened him Larwood.
Training such as it is today compared to what we did is well, different altogether. Just a few runs around the oval, and in my case, you had rabbit stew for Tuesday night and Thursday night for tea, and didn't mix too well running around the oval at night. And you'd work till 6 o'clock, of course, in those days. My yearly fee was £1 a week from North Sydney, and free board 15 shillings, and a job at Tewsbury for 19 and sixpence per week. Because see, I was only 20, so the basic wage was only about £4 a week or something like that, which was not too bad. But they also had an innovation there, they called the retention committee. It was money from the league itself for people out of work, like, you know, that didn't have a job playing league, and I was promised £1 a week from them. On the first day when we played Western Suburbs, the first competition game, we had to all line up at the Phillip Street and for the this retention business. And Mr. Jersey Flegg said to me, "Crippen, you're getting too much money already, you know, you won't be getting it." I said, "All right, thank you, Mr. Flegg," and walked out, and I said to Tom, I will tell you, well, I'm not playing today. He broke his word to my father, and I'm not playing. "Oh, yes, you've got to play." So they forced me to play. And as it turned out, we beat West, and they played in the semi-finals the year before. As I said, after the meeting of the retention committee, I was a little bit irate and had my tail up, as the saying goes, and I was playing opposite Cliffy Pearce, and I busted him once, and came to Jimmy Sharman, was the fullback for West. He's the only one in front, and I heard this, "I'm here," and I look over my shoulder, and a chap called Ferrier was there, ginger-headed lock, and he was steaming up on the outside, so I gave him the ball, and he scored the try. And when I got off the field, they said, "Why did you go and give it to him for? You could have scored yourself." But that wasn't my type of football.
36, I played with Archie Crippen, and he was injured. He was never really correct. Archie was a good player. He knew how to play.
They had what they called possible probables games in those days, and the English team was out here, of course, to New South Wales and England, and the possible probables used to play. and I got selected in those, playing in the centres, and more or less from there, they were sending a team to Queensland, and I was picked as a reserve back. And Frank Hurley, who was the winger at the time, he got hurt playing on the Saturday against the Englishmen. So when we got to Brisbane, they said, right, Crippen, you're on the wing. So they put me back on the wing again.
Who was captain of Australia?
Dave Brown.
What was it like to play with Dave Brown?
Dave was a brilliant player. Of course, his record shows you that. That he was a peculiar player in that wherever the ball was, he was, you know.
How did the Test series end up?
Well, we lost them 2-1. We won the first one and then lost the other two 12-7, 12-7. In Brisbane, I scored a try up there, runaway try.
And so they fight in midfield until Archie Crippen, New South Wales sensational winger, has the ball, and away he flies, just out, heads back. There's a wing three-quarter for you. He beats English fullback Ruff, and over he goes. A brilliant try.
What was it like to play on North Sydney?
Oh, it was very hard ground, but at the same time you had the speed. And it was a very fast ground because it wasn't spongy.
Who was your coach?
Jimmy Craig from Balmain.
Could you tell me a bit about him, please?
Jimmy was, well, he had represented Australia before, like, you know, and he played on practically every position on the field as a player, even fullback to hooker. He was one of the old-fashioned coaches, nothing fancy, not like Frank Burge.
Frank Burge was my coach in the stateside, in the city side and then the state side, you know, and he was a character. He was coach of the city side. All this would be about 1938, and we used to train out Sydney Cricket Ground number 2, you see, and anyhow. Joe Pearce was second row in the city side, and when all the photographers was there and the reporters, you know, down one end of the field, and Frank Burge would get it right up the other end. Up we'd go. He said, "Just a minute, I want to talk to you up here," where there were no reporters in. And he'd say, "Now listen, Joe, to Joe Pearce, on Saturday, when that Herb Narvo goes down, think it's your mother-in-law and give him Larry Dooley." See? Up, we'd put the scrum down, away we'd come down, and then he'd go on with some technical stuff, you know. Well, that's the sort of coach Frank was. He was a great player, but I wouldn't say a great technician, you know. But they were rough diamonds, but good men, though, just the same, you know. Their love of the game is undoubted.
Johnny Abel was one of the best centres I ever played with, and that includes Dave Brown, by the way. He was a solid, well, he was a partner. We played in the centres in 36, and we knew each other play backwards. And he was as good a footballer as any I ever had any to do with, Johnny. Well, we did lose the semi-final against Balmain, and I got taken off with my arm, dropped out the socket, and Roy Thompson, he got hurt too. So we finished up with 11 players.
Was in those days you couldn't replace players?
No.
No interchange?
No interchange, no.
Yeah, well, Fred Nolan, well, was like all the old-time hookers, you very seldom saw them, except when they put their head in a scrum and won the ball for you. They weren't like the hookers of today that are converted scrum halves. They were hard toilers, and that was probably, if he played a good game, you probably didn't side him much. But he was a great player, Fred Nolan. Laurie Ward was probably one of the best fullbacks we've ever had. He only played a couple of seasons with North, but he was a great player. And of course went on the tour with Roy Thompson and Freddie Nolan. Had 3 on that tour, which is, I think, the most they've probably ever had.
Roy Thompson, how they ever split it up for the 37 tour has got me beaten. He should have gone on that. See, they used to have all this, most of the time, the half and the 5/8 were club players or played together, and they split them up. Roy went and Rexy didn't. That was a travesty.
It was one of their last trip to go overseas by ship, so they had the best of everything. I know he had a reputation as a tough forward, but he was, as a man, he was a very gentle person. Very, very gentle. And quiet, very quietly spoken. And not a bit aggressive, except when he was on the football field. Harry McKinnon came along. He started his era about the same time as Acker, I think. And again, if your front row wasn't seen much while he was doing his job, but he certainly made his presence felt by his physical strength, and, well, you couldn't play in the front row in those days unless you were full of courage and full of meanness, and Harry had both.
The lock was the only one that did any joining in virtually with the backs, and so that when they went down for a scrum, it was a scrum, and they remained there, most of them, until Herb Narvo came in, and he became one of the running second rowers. He started it off, and the scrums used to remain as scrums and collapse on each other, and 9 times out of 10 it would result in a little bit of fisticuffs, but nothing serious to worry about.
I mean, Harry McKinnon and Bumper Farrell were the best of mates, but not on the field. Not on the field. You had a point to prove. I tackled with the express intention of breaking every bone in the body of the person who had the ball. And it wouldn't have worried me in the slightest, and I considered myself a clean player. But legitimately, I didn't kick anyone in the face or anything like that. But a tackle is a tackle.
Well, the battle between Harry McKinnon and Bumper Farrell, they were, nothing would be tolerated today what those chaps did to each other. I remember very well one day at North Sydney Oval, the game had fed. During the game there was a brawl outside the fence, and that was between Laurie Doran's brother and Bumper Farrell's brother. So it didn't only extend on the field, it was off the field as well with relatives. And after the game was over, Bumper supposedly wanted to go on with Jerry Scully. Well, Jerry was only about 18 or 19 in those days. And Harry said, don't pick on kids. If you want to pick on someone, try me. So they got into halts and they fought from the side of the ground to the gate, and we made headlines in the paper, and they were going to do dreadful things to them, but nothing was ever done. It was just taken then as part of the game. Henry Porter and Eddie Burns, they were men of the same mould as Bumper and Harry McKinnon and Laurie Doran and Frank Facer. They were battle royal. No, they didn't give any quarter, and they didn't expect to get one. I think if one ever gave way to the other, I think they wouldn't have been in first grade next week. They'd have just been, well, they wouldn't have lasted long because they know that they had their number, and well, a lot didn't last long. A lot of the young tyros come up to the front row, but they didn't last too long. Frank Facer, he was the first player I ever knew to wear a mouth guard. He had an old fighter's rubber mouth guard that fighters used to wear. I said to Harry one day, I said, does Frank Facer wear a mouth guard? He said, my word, he does. He said, he throws too many punches not to.
See, what happened, Bumper bit Harry McKinnon on the arm. And Harry McKinnon said to Bumper Farrell, he said, Bumper, he said, any man that would bite another bloke, his mother would have to be born with a double row of tits. So if you won't fight after that, you're not much bloody good, see? And Bumper said, that'll do me, Mac. So we go into the dressing room, and like it's a real hard day, and rooted sort of thing. And I'm just getting undressed like that, dying to have a shower and a cold bottle of beer, and we hear thump, thump, thump in the hallway between the two dressing rooms at North Sydney. And anyhow, they're into it, Bumper and Harry McKinnon. Well, we're saying the players were going to break it up, and the official said, no, give them 10 minutes, let them get out of their system. Well, I've seen some good fights in my life. This was an epic. Harry, we were saying, give it to him, Harry, come on. But at the same time, I must say that Bumper Farrell responded just as much as Harry. It was a romantic fight, and there was nothing between the two of them, you know. Anyhow, after 10 minutes, they broke it all up. But that was a classic.
After the game in that era, the era of the 1930s and the McKinnon, Facer, Doran era, I can't recall Harry going back, but I know Frank Facer and Jerry Scully and Laurie Doran, they'd all retire to the local hotel and have a drink. In fact, it has been known that after they'd played 80 minutes of football and that Frank Facer and Jerry Scully had a difference of opinion, they'd go and knuckle up. So
when we were hearing of what was going on in Europe in the mid-1930s, didn't have the faintest idea or suspicion that a war was going to break out. In 1939, I was playing with Balmain. We won the competition in 1939, and we were going to. They were going to. The mayor was there and said they were going to set a garbage cart up with streamers and balloons. They're going to take us around the district, you know. And over the radio came the Prime Minister saying, Hitler has invaded Poland and we are at war. That was the night that we won the competition in 1939. And from then on, well, you know, cold water was poured on everything and everybody. And what's more, something a lot of people didn't know, and I didn't tell anybody, I had signed to play with Bradford Northern in England, and I hadn't mentioned it to Balmain at that stage. So that all, see, our lives were upset in so many different ways. You know, as I've often spoken to Gaby about it, I mean, our children might have finished up Poms, but I never mentioned it. I was afraid to mention it after that.
In 1940, I was reserve grade captain, and we had to win the last 7 games, like that, to get into the semi-finals. And in that, like that, we won the 7 games on the trot, and we had to beat St George twice. We beat them in the semi-final, and then we beat them in the grand final in 1940. 1941, I was fortunate enough to be selected as a third-grade coach, which I done well. We got them into the semi-finals, and in 1942, I was elected as coach of the reserve grade side in 1942, and we won the premiership again in 1942, which was a great honour.
I was captain of Balmain in 1941, and we in fact won the club championship. But my mother had moved moved over to Lane Cove, which is in the North Sydney area. Well, I used to go from Lane Cove to Leichhardt Oval to train. Now, towards the end of the 1941 season, whilst playing with Balmain, Harold Matthews said to me, the secretary of Balmain, if you're living in Lane Cove for 12 months, you'll have to play with North Sydney. I said, all right, but what do you suggest? He said, well, go, before the 12 months is up, go back and change your address to the University Hotel again. I said, okay, that'll do me for 28 days. So I went back and stayed at the University Hotel for another 28 days. I did it physically, you know, there's no question about it. And anyhow, then I went back and stayed with my mother. And 42 came, and I'm captain of Balmain again, training over at Leichhardt Oval and everything, and I got a letter in the post to appear before the residential qualification. North Sydney had protested on me playing with Balmain. So I said, oh, don't worry. I said, you know, on instructions from Harold Matthews. So up I went to the residential qualifications committee, and you wouldn't believe it, Harold Matthews couldn't produce the rent receipts for my board at the University Hotel. And as a result, they said, you play with North Sydney or nobody. And so, from captain of Balmain, I had to go to North Sydney. And well, I retired. I decided if I couldn't play with Balmain, I won't play with anybody. And well, the whole committee came up to my place at Lane Cove, and they talked me around, and that's how I came to play with North Sydney in 42. Jack O'Reilly was coach, already appointed coach of North Sydney, and Rex Harrison handed the captaincy of North Sydney over to me as soon as I arrived at North Sydney, and that's how I captained Norths in 42. Right, we went through the season with all the difficulties associated with fitting into a new area, and we had developed a side which, although we didn't do any good in the competition, we had some good players.
Well, it was very difficult to get things, of course. We had the rationing with foodstuffs, certain foodstuffs, clothing, rationing the clothing and that kind of thing, linen, all those sort of things were rationed. So you could only get what you could use your coupons for.
Of course, everybody was building air raid shelters and all this, all the thoughts that the Japanese were going to bombard Sydney.
Yes, it was difficult. Floodlights, of course, were out. Even with cars, you had to have lights on your cars that only focused on the ground in front of you. And couldn't be seen from an aircraft and all that sort of thing, you know. They were the difficulties. We had to train as much as possible in the daylight, and there was more coaching than training. You had to train, get yourself fit as best you could, instead of training under lights and working moves and all that, unless it was in the daylight.
I played in a second grade team that won the comp up there, trained by Acker Forbes. But then, of course, when I decided to go into the second row, I had a very good year in 43. Now, 1943 was the year captain coached by Frank Hyde.
Now, we had a beautiful fullback there, Neville Butler. I played with Neville in the state side. He came from Wollumbar, and we had him there in 42 and a little of 43. A beautiful fullback, you know, and he was killed incidentally in an aircraft. And we were building up with play. I brought a player down. See, I was captain and coach of Waratah Mayfield in Newcastle in 40. And I brought a winger down. He was in the Air Force, Ron Ainsworth, and he was in the side. Frankie Collins, he was a lifesaver, he was the Australian beach sprint champion. Well, he was on one wing, and Ron Ainsworth on the other wing for the 43 season. And then, of course, we had Harry Taylor. Harry Taylor, the closest thing to Johnny Raper that I've seen on a football field. But you all know the story in the grand final. He was supposed to turn up at the ground, but the newspapers said that he was picked up by the provost of his AWL, but he was on his way to New Guinea in a troop ship on the day of the grand final and didn't play. So all other sides had their problems too. But we made it to the grand final. I've heard it said that we were raging favourites for the grand final, but let me tell you, in 1943, we played Newtown in the first round at Henson Park, and it was a 5-all draw, which was a feat in itself, you know, with Newtown, with the side they had. We played them at the cricket ground in the second round, and we beat them 16-10. We played them in the first semi-final and beat them by 21-15, and that put them out. But because they were minor premiers, they had the right of challenge. We beat St George in the final by 25-19, and then the next week we played Newtown in the grand final and they walloped us. But bear in mind about us being raging favourites for the grand final. At the end of the 2 rounds, Newtown were on top of the competition, equal with Balmain on 21 points. In 3rd and 4th position were St George and North Sydney on 17 points, and 1 point behind them on 16 points was South Sydney. So that's how much raging favourites we were for the grand final, and that the collapse, of course, in the grand final day, 62,000 people, and nothing went right for us. We didn't finalise the team before half an hour before the side went on the field. Butler had been killed in the Air Force, and Stan Ridgway was fullback. We had to bring in Maxie Whitehead as a forward because Harry Taylor was on a troop ship going to New Guinea and wasn't there. Don McKinnon went to lock. Frank Facer, unfortunately, went on the field with an injury that would normally have put him out for weeks and weeks and didn't say anything about it. Look, these are not excuses. These are just a couple of reasons why we weren't at our best. On the day, we had 13 and they had 13, and they donkey licked us 34-7.
It was a memorable day in this respect. Now, to start with, it was a racist Saturday, and every person in uniform was admitted free. So there's virtually about 80,000 people. So to get onto the ground, the whole place was packed. In the old days with Sheridan Stand, that people could stand like sardines. So there was an enormous crowd there, and they'd closed the gates at 12 o'clock. So when Frank Hyde came in to give us our instructions, he said, I must tell you something. He said, this is the biggest crowd the Sydney Cricket Ground's ever had, which it was. Now, they had the people all spread all over the ground, not only in the grandstands, they were packed. So to get to the playing field, we had to weave our way through the people. But anyhow, we got soundly beaten.
I think that Newtown analysed our game too well. Kelly McMahon was 5'8", and we won a lot of games by Kelly short kicking the ball and others following through and harassing the opposition and getting them to lose the ball. But in the grand final, Newtown dropped this as soon as the scrum had formed. We'd won the ball. Their fullback dropped back into cover with the fullback, and when Kelly McMahon short kicked, Keith Froome was always there to collect the ball, and I think they organised better than we did, looking at it.
That particular year, I'll digress just for a moment. A bloke called Hockey Burnell came from Camaray. He was a boxer, outstanding boxer, and he fought Vic Patrick, and Vic Patrick was a Newtown bloke. So we get beaten Hockey Benell, Fitzpatrick knocks Hockey Benell out at about 7 rounds, and the fight on the Friday night. So we play Newtown in the grand final. They give us a hiding. We go to Newtown's ball that night. The big Mealy starts fight. 12 of our blokes went to hospital. North Sydney. I thought that was a great weekend for North Sydney. I said, every bloody thing went wrong.
You know what the week of a grand final is like. Every radio station's ringing you up. Every newspaper wants photos and all that sort of thing. And I was spending most of my time in training and going up to the Mater Misericordia Hospital to see Gaby and the new baby. And after that grand final, I came straight from the ground up to the hospital and put my head on the bed and cried.
The war years probably didn't have such an effect on crowds, but there was more money about and people had to find an outlet for their emotions and for sport, and to follow rugby league was one of them.
The lady that lived next door to me had a son who was a prisoner of war in Changi for about 4 years. Luckily came home okay, but other people around the place, around the district, were prisoners of war, and of course their families were devastated. It was very hard on them.
Oh, gee, it was tough. It was a tough place, that New Guinea was. Oh, gee. I was with 4 Squadron, and our unit was very, very poor. I was lucky to come back.
I was an instructor in telecommunications, and my application to enlist was knocked back. I was forbidden, but most of the 43 side was dissipated by the services, and we just were also Wrens in 44. And then I retired in 45. I hung on till 45, and that was it.
North Sydney had a great following of rugby league because it went from, the support came from Hornsby right down to Lane Cove, a big area. So North had a tremendous following. You know, it was a great atmosphere around North at the time.
Well, the South Coast, Bermagui was more of a fishing village, timber cutters, sleeper cutters, and a few farms, but the main money that came in was mostly through like sleeper cutting and fishing. And we didn't have water, electricity. We had kerosene lights, lamps, and petrol lamps. Our wireless used to be run by a battery. We had like a 12-volt battery or a 6-volt battery. I don't know what it was, but it used to be all right. And we didn't get power. Like, I came up here when I was 17, and we didn't get power from, I think it was the following 2 years after that we got power and water laid on. But until then, like, it was all hand. Everything was hand done. To have a bath, we didn't bath for a week, and every one of us used to use the bath, the one bath, you know, with the water in, because the water was so scarce. And we even bought sort of saltwater soap, you know, that you could sort of have a good wash down to the surf, which we used to do. Like, after we finished work, we'd go down and surf. We surfed winter and summer, and that was the way we lived.
My father, Harry McKinnon, I can only remember seeing him play twice. I remember seeing him playing in a trial game out at Earl Park. Well, the only other game that I can remember him playing was he played in a first grade game against South Sydney at the sports ground. And he went over for 2 tries, typical forwards tries. He just sort of barged his way over from dummy half, but it was still 2 tries. And I can remember, as if it was yesterday, that after the game, as he walked up towards the dressing room, he looked up into the grandstand where I was, and he winked at me. And I would have been about probably 10 years old at the time, and I can still remember it to this day. But his his reputation for toughness, or his name for toughness, didn't extend to his family. He was a very kind man at home. A very kind and friendly man.
Just before I came to Sydney, say 47, football was big, but in favour of, say, there used to be only about six towns that used to play in the comp down there: Cobargo, Narooma, Bateman's Bay, Bega, and sometimes Bombala. And where we used to play football, we used to travel everywhere in an open truck that used to have tarpaulins around the side, and we used to have seats across from, we were like a cattle truck. Used to have seats going across from side to side, and we'd sit on that cold winter's day, and that's the way we used to go to the football if we had to travel to football. Up the Brown Mountains, freezing cold, but that's the way we did it.
Many friends, knowing that I loved the game, said, why don't you be a referee? And I thought, oh, never that in my lifetime. But in 1944 I did go to Balmain, and I did fairly well that first year doing finals, to be quite honest. And next year I had the appendix out, and the third year around was 1946, and I refereed a President's Cup final at the cricket ground, North Sydney and Manly. That was prior to the English Test versus Australia. And it was an excellent game of football, and I can still remember Reggie James as the 5'8" then, who eventually went into first grade, as all them, a lot of the Manly fellas did, because of the stepping stone from that final to their first appearance in first grade only 6 months later.
Parramatta and Manly came into the competition together in 1947, and well, as you know, Parramatta was a great rugby league area, and Manly was just blossoming, has become one. Houses were going up in French's Forest, Belrose, and in that area. And I'm pretty certain it was Harry McKinnon that proposed they come in, and Acker seconded it, that they be admitted to the competition, even though ill feeling sprung up between supporters of the clubs and has been evident ever since. I don't think the officials had ever been bad friends. Well, I'm sure they weren't. But North Sydney lost a lot of great players like Kelly McMahon, Frank Collins and Bertie Collins, Johnny Bliss, Jimmy Hall, Max Whitehead. You can't lose 8 or 9 players and have the same strength, but the crowd started to come in about that era. Manly were getting good crowds.
I said to my sister, oh, blasted football's on now, see. So she helped me get all my gear. I just went out to Manly, and I hadn't spoken to anybody, nobody spoke to me. They said, right, you're the captain.
Yes, I became ball boy for North Sydney in 1947, and I kept the job for the next 2 years, 1948 and 1949. The first year I was there, they were coached by Cliff Pearce. The first grade side was coached by Cliff Pearce, and they had a fairly young side, as I remember, and they gained the services of a brilliant goal kicker by the name of Tom Kirk, who came over from Newtown. He kicked thousands of goals for Newtown, and then he came over to North. And I think he kicked something like 60 or 70 goals for North Sydney that year, and they just missed out on the semi-finals. And they were the years when players that went on to become stalwart North Sydney players like Normie Strong, Bobby Sullivan, Keith Middleton, folks like that, first came to North Sydney.
I was a local junior, and I used to live at Chatswood, and I played for Christian Brothers Old Boys, and I got called up to grade. I was only 17 at the time, and I played in the third grade and then the second grade, and the last game of the year, that year I played in the first grade against South at the Sydney Sports Ground. In 1948 I started off in second grade, got graded second grade, and went up to first grade at the end of the season. I remember my first game against Newtown. Frank Farrell had his fingers stuck up my nose, trying to tear my nose off my face, you know, and I thought to myself at the time, Jesus, if I'm going to survive in this, I've got to change my attitude, and which I did.
What was your attitude?
Well, do unto others before they do it to you. And a liberal application thereof.
And we were invited up from North. We got a letter and we were invited up to go up to North and try out. That was in 48. Bill and I came up and we lived at Artarmon. We boarded there, and I just turned 17 and Bill was 19. We thought it was just wonderful, you know, to come up and play city football. All we could do down Bermagui was like listen to it on the radio, and if your battery was flat you wouldn't get a radio. The chap I first played with when I came down, which was like 1948, I'd have rated Frank Cottle as one of the chaps that gave me some great hints, like on how to play centre and 5'8". Coach-wise, I'd have rated Frank Hyde was the chap that gave me that little extra push that made me think that I am good, you know. And then I'd have said perhaps Ross McKinnon, like who was another coach in the 52, 53, 54. I'd have rated Ross McKinnon as a great man to have as say as a minder and a coach, the same thing.
Some powers that be from Bond Industries, at that given time, I was a pretty good replica of Chesty Bond. At the time I was about, 15.5, 16 stone and a big, decent euro meat and all that, but I did look much like Chesty Bond. So they decided to make me Chesty Bond. So I thought, oh, all right, you know, so they decked me out in a singlet and I was on that Terry Deer amateur hour. I was interviewed down Martin Place and they made a big issue of it because I was the first Chesty Bond.
I was asked by Radio 2SM if I would do a couple of tapes of calling, because at that stage Reg Grundy, who was the sports director of 2SM and used to do the football broadcasts with Jack Coyne as his offsider, Reg Grundy had a falling out with 2SM, and they asked me would I do a few tapes. Well, I did, and they were shocking too, incidentally. They suggested that I go and have a few lessons from the great voice of the ABC, Bryson Taylor, who had an elocution class in town. He wasn't very hopeful at the time. He said my H's weren't coming through and my INGs weren't coming through. And I did a few more, and he said that I was improving, but he said you'd never ever be a BBC broadcaster. And I said, well, I have no intention of trying to be a BBC broadcaster. My first broadcast was a title fight between George Barnes and George Capine. And for a while, before the football season started in '53, I did the fights from the stadium. And anyhow, I kept going back to Bryson Taylor, and I had them punching in the clinches and breaking from the clinches, and he hit him with the left and all that sort of thing. Anyhow, it seemed to satisfy the sponsor, and then I started to broadcast the football, and well, things must have gone all right because I was never ever beaten in a survey.
There's the kick by Johnny Graves, which misses, and it's taken in the in-goal area by Pure Bear. But there's Churchill and Stanmore, back to Churchill, and out it goes now to Graves, but he's caught by Contraston on the far side.
There's my old mate Frank Hyde doing his call. Always good to see Frank.
A job came up in the Department of Mines in Sydney, and this job consisted of the men loading and unloading boxes of dynamite and gelignite and all that sort of thing up in the magazines in Middle Harbour. And Harry did that for a year or two, and then one of the head men in the Department of Mines came down, got to know him, and he said, there's a job as an inspector going in the office. He said, I'd like you to put in for it, which he did, and he got it. And so he worked then going all around the country, wherever there was explosives, petrol, all that sort of thing. He had to go and inspect it to see everything was safe, you know.
Well, Bumper was head of the white squad. Bumper was a very well-known figure up beyond the cross.
But I can recall coming and watching North Sydney. This would have been in the mid-40s, and two players struck me back in those days that I used to watch closely because both of them played fullback. One was Doug Dietz and the other one was Frank Cottle. And I used to watch how they played and how their positional play, kicking for the line, and as I said, fullback play was quite different. Churchill changed the play a great deal. My intention of work as I left school was to become a draftsman, and the only way that I could get into the engineering drafting was to go through the telegram messenger stage, and I did this at the GPO in Sydney. As a messenger in the early days, I can recall seeing this word eternity written on footpaths, and the thing that stuck in my mind was the fact that it was in a copper plate hand, and because I was becoming a draftsman, I was very much aware of the quality of handwriting that went into this word eternity, and yet at age 16 it didn't mean anything to me. I just saw it often on the footpaths.
Rugby league was pretty successful, but I think especially internationally it was part of a time, for instance, when the French rugby league team were very successful. At that stage, Dr. H.V. Evatt, the leader of the Federal Opposition Labor Party, was the patron of rugby league, and he probably too was a pretty good ambassador for rugby league. I suspect that the big games were very, very popular indeed. But it's the beginning in economic terms of what economic historians call the long boom, the period when jobs are plentiful, partly to do because all the urban infrastructure is being developed, new suburbs are being opened up.
I made first grade right at the start, 17-year-old, very green, very bushy, very green. I played for Australia when I was 19. I played in Sydney, first test. Second test I played in Queensland. And third test was at the Sydney Cricket Ground again.
What position did you?
I played centre, centre three-quarter, alongside Doug McRitchie.
And who'd you play?
We played the Englishman, Great Britain, and on that era, that it was the first time the test was won back. We beat England for 30 years.
I played Sydney first against the All-Stars, that American All-Star side, and that was quite an experience, to be honest with you, the way they come out and trained and threw the ball around, which we hadn't seen before. The 5'8" that I played against, he would prop and he'd throw the ball halfway across the field to his winger or something without going through the centres or anything. He'd just prop and bang straight across the field. It was quite an experience. And the jumpers, well, George was a bit of a fashion sort of fella, and he was pretty keen on trying to flashen up your jumper and put a bit more style into it, and that was the George Martin that we knew. You know, he was a little bit of a flash sort of fella, and he bought a few little nicks and knacks and to jazz us up a little bit, I suppose.
In those days, nobody had cars. I used to get I lived at Lane Cove, and any transport going to the games, you had to go by train or tram, or that's what I remember about that. That was the worst part, because after you'd had a bit of a shellacking for 80 minutes through the day, you didn't feel like catching the tram home to wherever you had to go.
I played with Chatswood Juniors with Peter O'Brien, and another fellow named Bill O'Brien, and my brother John, of course. But then we had the other players coming from the country. Peter Versii come up from the south coast. Lloydie Hudson come from Kempsey. Cess Waters had been there, and he'd been one of the fellas come back from the army, and Cess would have been one of the nicest and toughest blokes you'd ever want to meet. Ben Haslam come from Newcastle area, Don Everton from the same sort of area. Alan Archie was local junior. Horry Toole come from down the railway. George Martin come across from New Zealand. Keith Middleton come from Bega. And we had Cess, Lloydie Hudson and Normie Strong, which was local junior. Then there was 2 or 3 other. Jackie McLean come from Barrel. So there was, there was about 18 of us that were pretty good football. That's all we thought we were. And we had some good coaches. We had Ross McKinnon, we had Rex Harrison, both very good coaches. Rex was very good to me. He understood 5'8" play better than I ever did, to be honest with you, because I used to play half-back till Donny Burge and Jimmy Gillen come along, and I got shifted to 5'8". And Rex was very good to me. I don't think I would ever play for Australia only for Rex Harrison.
It was 1951, I played President Cup, and then after President Cup I played one third grade game and one second grade game, and I was picked to play the last game in first grade, but I had the flu and I didn't play, and the next year I contested the halfback position with the incumbent half at the time, Bobby Sullivan, and our new coach Ross McKinnon. After one game, he told the selectors that Gillen half, Sullivan 5'8".
From my own point of view, I was never on a contract with North Sydney. We used to get paid a dividend of the gate. The first grade used to get paid 80% to 15%, second grade was 15%, and the third grade was 5% of the official gate takings. How they worked that out, but that was the deal. I think about £230 odd was the highest payment I ever got. But that didn't, I wanted to play for North Sydney, and that was, because my tradition was with North Sydney, and I just wanted to be with North Sydney.
We played one year in 7 matches of the day at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and from what I recall, I don't think the smallest crowd was 38,000, I think it was, of our games, and the biggest one that I can remember was, I think it was 54,000. At the cricket ground for a club game.
On a Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, it was good stuff. I can remember walking out onto North Sydney Oval. We had to come out of the dressing sheds. We had to walk through the people. They had to clear a passageway for us to get onto the field. That's how many people were in North Sydney Oval at that particular game. But I thought this will be lovely if a blues starts. Yeah, we're going to get out of here.
The amount of money that I made during that period of 52 through to 55 was... It seemed a lot to me. I couldn't believe that people wanted to pay you money for something you liked doing.
We'd go to the cricket ground. When we went to the cricket ground, you'd walk in with your tie on and coat and everything, and hardly before you said good day to anybody, you'd look out in around to all the stands and see how many were there, and think, we've got to get 14,000 in first before we get a cent out or a shilling out of it. And you'd walk in, say, how is it today? Hoping that the people would fall over themselves to come in the turnstiles so we could get a quid out of it.
No, they're an attractive side. They play good football, and their seconds and thirds play good football in those days. To be quite honest, if you had missed out on a first-grade appointment and you were fortunate enough to get North's reserves, say, and South's or Balmain reserves, it wasn't a bad game, but it was a stepping stone to a first-grade appointment because they both played attractive football.
In 1952, Ross McKinnon was contracted, and Ross came with quite a few new players. I always considered that year we had an excellent forward team. Lloyd Hudson, Cess Waters, Don Everett in the front row, Ben Haslam and Colin Lay in the second row, with Peter Diversey at lock. And, in anyone's money, that's a good pack of forwards. And I always thought that we won most of our games behind that. And one thing that Ross McKinnon could do was to instill confidence in the team. I can remember vividly one day at the Sydney Cricket Ground, we came off and we were 17-3 down at half-time. And he really got into us at half-time. And we went back and we won something like 25-17. But it was just the power that he had over the team. As time went on, he was there for 3 years, I believe. There were times that I thought that perhaps he was getting too close to some of the players, and it was unfortunate. He lost his impact with the team. But it was a very rewarding period for me to be with the team during those 3 years and to go right through. And we were very unlucky that we got beaten by South Sydney in one of those years, 5-4.
And see, we got to the final in 52. And in those days, when the teams went on the field we used to run on, we'd stand opposite each other. And then after the ref spoke to us, North Sydney would say to South Sydney, which we did, North Sydney 3 cheers for South. And we'd say, hip hip hooray. And then South would say, South Sydney 3 cheers for North. This was before the game, and they did that. Then after that, you would shake hands with the chap opposite you and say, all the best for today. And I happened to be opposite Johnny, a great man, and a great friend too of mine, Wacker Graves. He said, I'm only on here for 2 things today, Gillan, to flatten you and Martin. Well, 5 minutes into the game, I went down the blind side, and I had everyone beat, I'm quite sure. I had him to beat, and I had Peter O'Brien, our winger, outside me. Now, I looked to give it to Peter. If he takes me, I give it to Peter. But if he stays with Peter, I go through. Well, I thought he was going to stay with Peter, but he didn't. He just stepped aside, put his arm out, and he stiff-armed me, and I was knocked out. He knocked Georgie Martin out later on, and Georgie was a passion for the rest of the game. And,
you know, I can remember we were leading a 4-3 right up until very late in the game. And damn me, they got a goal, kick at a goal, and it was one of these very muddy days where I can remember Churchill kicked it. It was close in almost in front of the goal mouth. I still thought he had problems because he had to sweep the mud up to make a mound for him to get the ball to sit on it. You can actually see the ball sinking in the mud. It wasn't a firm mound. And yet he still scooped it over and they beat us 5-4.
Yeah, the first time I saw them was 1954. It was at the SCG. They played Souths, the mighty Souths with Clive Churchill, and they beat them 14-11, and it was very exciting. And they needed to win to get into the semi-finals. The next week against St George, it was 15-14. Alan Archie had a kick at goal.
And I can always recall that we scored in the corner right on the death. And I had to kick this goal from the sideline. Now, at the end of the game, you don't have nerves. You know, you might have when you go onto the field, but not at the end of the game. And to me, I practice all of my kicks from the sideline. And I kicked this ball, and I thought it was going straight. And when it got to about 5 yards off the goalpost, the wind sort of took it away. And
one flag went up, one flag went down, and the referee said, no goal and full time. So that was pretty much the North story.
Having a fellow like Peter Diversey playing lock forward, or Jimmy Gilling or Donnie Birch playing halfback, all contributed to it, because the way Peter tackled, you could guarantee that some of the 5'8" weren't over keen about doing too much with the way Peter knocked them around, so it made my job a lot easier. I would have liked to play a test match with Peter, but I didn't.
What year did you play for Australia?
54.
54.
And second test in 54, we got beat. I got dropped. So I perhaps didn't play well. You look back on it now, you would have liked the second chance. It didn't come. That a lot of us felt we should have won a competition. We got beaten twice by a point in a semi-final and a final. And when, you know, from our own point of view, we'd better off getting beat by 20, because we would have thought you had no chance of winning. When you get beaten by a point, you think you had a chance of winning. And that's hurt a little bit. I think one of the reasons a lot of us stopped back with the club to try to win that competition.
Harry McKinnon and Aga Forbes, I think they were like people that end up in a lot of those positions, including in Parliament, is that they just sort of fall into the position. They were looking for a president, and Dad got the job. That was in 1948. And I particularly remember that he used to be very nervous making speeches and that sort of thing at the time. But as the years rolled by, he became probably the best speech maker that I've ever heard.
Harry was the president when I first came up, and Acker was the assistant secretary. Bill Davern was the secretary then. Bill was a customs officer down on the wharves. He was the one that actually started the Leagues Club.
I can remember in 1955-56 the government policy toward Leagues clubs were now being relaxed. Prior to that, the poker machines weren't accepted, weren't a part of our social behaviour at that time. But come 1956, the government opened the gate and said that clubs could have these poker machines. They didn't allow the hotels. It was only these new clubs. And very quickly, most of the football clubs developed their own club. Now, in the case of North Sydney bought an old premises in Merlin Street, just over the back of the North Sydney No. 2 ground.
Yeah, the club at Merlin Street was, because an old home converted into a club. And it was Sunday morning. They used to close about 1 o'clock at lunchtime. And often you'd go there a Sunday morning for a drink. And halfway through the drinking session, Bill Davern would say, "All right, the beer's off for an hour." Why? Because we want you to do some work. And he'd have work, rafters there for you to hold on to while they propped part of the club up for additions that were being done. Everything was done by voluntary labour, and they used to keep the beer, they had no draft beer, all beer was in bottles, and that was kept in an old bathtub that went with the house when they bought it. They used to throw blocks of ice in there to keep the bottles cold. But that's from, as they say, from little seeds mighty acorn grow, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where she all started. Bill Davern did terrific work in those days, along with Harry McKinnon, Acker Forbes, Johnny McLaughlin, Darcy Duffy, all good, hard-working, honest men. Such was their honesty, there was no check or anything on money that was taken in those days, but there was never a penny missing. Great men.
You've had to get good players, you had to give them some enticement to come there. And the Leagues Club and the poker machines was the way out of doing that.
Frank Hazel was on the board, and very jovial man, very pleasant person. And in later years, Acker Forbes' firm folded, so he was out of work, and they gave him the full-time paid job as a secretary of the Leagues Club, football club rather. And he was only the second in Sydney who had a job like that. Frank Facer was the first to be made a full-time secretary at St George, and Harry Forbes after that.
But in those days, fullback play was quite different from fullback play today. The possession being what it is today wasn't applicable then, and I used to find that we'd get into kicking duels between fullbacks, and the forwards would ring the fullback at each end to stop him from running. And you had to be good to catch the ball. You couldn't fumble it because the forwards would come in on you. But I always found that I was a good kick, whether it be a punt or drop kick or a place kick, because that was the way the game was in those days.
You never collapsed the scrum because it was bloody suicide, you know. You'd have a job getting up after that once you collapsed the scrum. But that was part of the business too. But it was the expertise needed to win the ball in those days was terrific. A terrific combination between the two front rowers and the halfback and the hooker and the second row, most important. And it was all done in a split second.
Yeah, well, in 1953, Sess Waters took me over to North Sydney and
got me into a trial over there, and then got into reserve grade where we won the 1955 premiership. Then I made it into first grade in 56 to 59, and I was lucky enough to be chosen in the state side where I played second row with Ron Lynch and Johnny Raper was lock, so we virtually had 3 locks in that side.
Looking back on my playing career, I don't think that it ever really occurred to me what grade I played. I thought I just went down there and presented myself, and I played in whatever grade the selectors saw fit.
In the mid-50s, we finished 5th on 3 or 4 occasions, and there wouldn't have taken much to have gone a little bit further. And we had Trevor Allen there at 57, I think it was, when Trevor was there. And Trevor was such a good footballer in his rugby union days, and when the time he played with North Sydney, and such a nice bloke with it too. It was a privilege to all of us fellas to be involved with Trevor, because he was, he had the reputation of being one of Australia's best rugby union players and captains of the Australian side. That it was an honour to be with him. Perhaps we just lacked a little bit of the top class ability to finish off what Trevor was trying to do with us. But Trevor was carrying an injury a few times too in the career he had in North Sydney. I don't think he was as fit as he was when he played at his top rugby union, and that's understandable after being to England and all that sort of thing. His bones might have been getting a little bit weary by then. But it was an experiment that the management of the club had to do at the time, and it almost paid off. Like the times before, when in the early 50s, when we had Ross McKinnon there and Rex Harrison, we almost paid off again.
In 1956, Australia got television. It was brought out for the Olympic Games in Melbourne, and it was after watching the games and how games then start to be televised. You wouldn't get the whole game televised, but you get news clips in the evening of black and white television. And it was at that time, 56, 57, that I was becoming interested in movie photography, and it was close to my retirement that I started to think about how I could use this as a coaching aid so that we could show the players, usually on the Thursday night, because it took me a few days to get the film in and get it developed and get it back so that I could show it on the Thursday night after the game last Saturday.
In 1956 we played St George at North Sydney Oval, and that was the start of their 11-year run. And what was, even though we got beaten 25 to 13, that wasn't too bad, because in 1955 we lost Cess Waters and Lloydie Hudson at the end of the season, and Peter DeVersey moved to the bush. Peter O'Brien retired, Georgie Martin retired, and Bob Sullivan went away for a season. We knew that St George were a motivative side. They could throw the ball anywhere and score from anywhere, so it was a matter of get up and knock them down if we could, and if we got the ball, keep possession and try and take them on. In 1957 we played East at North Sydney Oval, and again North Sydney was a dust bowl again, lived up to its natural form, and we went down that game 1916, but East always give us a hard game. I don't think any game was easy in those days. It's like today. It was pretty competitive, and you were out to beat the opposition, and North, in those days they used to say North were the easy beats, but we were out to prove them wrong.
Tell me, when was it played? Was it played on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon?
It was played on a Saturday afternoon. I don't think the Sunday football started to about 58, if my memory's right. All the grade was played on Saturday. The crowds had averaged round about anything from 5,000 to 8,000. In 1957, the New South Rugby League decided that they would send a first grade side to Perth just to boost the game over there, and early in the year they had a ballot and North came out first. Well, when we left Mascot, it took about 11 hours to get over there, and sitting in a plane for that long in those days seemed to be eternity. We played 2 games. On the Saturday we played West Australian Metropolitan side, and because the weather was unkind before we got there, on the Saturday We were supplied a set of club jumpers from another clubs to keep ours right for Sunday, and on the Sunday we played Perth. We played in the North Sydney colours, and we won both games. I'm not too sure of the scores, but we won comfortably.
Can we talk about Brian Carlson?
Yeah, well, Brian Carlson was a big name player when he first came to us. He was a big time player then, and I think he'd be probably, in my estimation, probably one of the all-time greats, because he was such a fella that you could be out till bloody 4 o'clock in the morning and then go and play a test match and have a wow of a game the next day. Now, a fellow like that is pretty good for Australian side, but with a club side, younger blokes tend to think that they can do the same thing. Instead of applying themselves to the job in hand, they think that they could stay out and play up at all sorts of hours and go and play a club game. And they could have been much better players and lasted longer if they'd have not taken that notice. Now, that's not being derogatory to Brian, because he was one in a million that could do it.
He was such a gifted player that I don't think he had to do much to be a good player. He was just a complete natural footballer. There's not too many people you could compare with Brian, because he never looked 100% fit, because he was always fairly thick-set sort of a fella. But he could just play football. That was his. He was gifted with an ability to do something. And he could do it.
Oh, great love. Tremendous player. He came from Des Moines Rugby Union, and great player, and a happy, smiling fella. You know, when he got a belt in the gob and that, he's smiling. You know, you'd have to square up for him. He's only a little fella.
In 1959, this is a game between Norse and Manly reserve grade at the cricket ground, and we know that the reserve grade went on to win. They beat St George in the grand final that year, and they were captain coached by Bob Sullivan. Now, Bob was a good tactician. He could turn a side around by just watching for their movements and calling a player like myself to come to the outie side or go to the blind and take someone. He could just pick the move that was going on. He was a natural 5'8", and we know that Bob went on to be a good committee man and to go on and later be president of the club.
Irvine, I can always recall that Irvine came through from junior football through the reserve grade, and I can recall on one evening Bobby Sullivan and I took Ken over onto the sideline of North Sydney Oval, and we were teaching him how to beat a fullback. You won't beat a fullback if you try and get between him and the sideline, because he hasn't got to run as far as you have, or the winger might have. And I can recall that we showed him how to keep the fullback in to give him enough room to get round on the outside of him. But we talked to him, and this was when he was a young kid. He would have only been 17 at this time, and he was showing great prospect. Following year he played first grade and was never beaten from that time on. I can always recall, to this day, he's the best winger I have ever seen. And I've seen a lot of them from England and France and a lot of Australian and New Zealanders. Nobody tops Ken Irvine.
I think the best player that ever played with Norse was Ken Irvine. In the 1950s, we had the services of three brilliant international players in Ken McCaffrey, Brian Carlson and Greg Haywick.
O'Shea feeds it out again. Out it goes to McCaffrey. McCaffrey then out to Haywick. Haywick on to Carlson. Carlson making the extra man, came up in the movement.
Brian Carlson, I think, would have to rate in the top probably 20 of footballers that ever lived. And Greg Haywick not far behind him. McCaffrey certainly was a brilliant player. He had a lot of bad luck with injury, but as a footballer out of this world.
Well, North Sydney supporters have a very strong sense of stoicism. They've got a very dry wit. One time I was talking to this old bloke who'd followed North Sydney all his life, and I said, "You're going to go out to Mudgee and see Halley's Comet?" And he said, "Nah, I saw it the first time round. It's overrated." And that was the kind of humour that they're prepared to wait, and they're prepared to put things into context.
They used to televise the second half of the games, where they'd pick a game and they'd televise the second half of the game. And it'd be a mad rush all through the week to try and catch a glimpse of yourself playing, but never ever did, fortunately. But it was good. It was great for the game, but it got too clinical then. Well, it brought things up too close. You had to change your tactics.
Beware of the bears. We're determined and we just don't care who we play or who we maul. Our team's gonna rule them all. We're mean, we're on the prowl. Our team's gonna knock them out. Everybody's gonna scream and shout. The red and blacks are gonna make us proud. So beware of the bears and be scared of the bears. Yes, beware of the bears. Beware of the bears. Beware of the bears. No stop, or all go. The bears are here, so let the people know. Determination, pure guts. Our team's gonna knock